All right, what's up, everyone? I am Tyler. Let me get this going. Cool. So I'm Tyler Mcginnis. For my job, I work at a Learn to Code school here in Utah called Dead Mountain. And so I teach for a living. So I think I'm good at it, but some people disagree. I also happen to be a Firebase expert. I'm part of their experts program. Good news is some of their developers are here. So if you have any hardcore questions, ask them. If you have any easy questions, I'm your guy. Who here, just to give a little bit of a background check on everyone, who here has experience with Firebase? Cool, so some of you don't. Perfect. Not to worry. So we're going to be talking a lot about authentication, specifically with Firebase. Who has experience authenticating with things not Firebase, like Passport? It's pretty tricky, right? I was talking to one of my buddies today as I was preparing this talk, and he mentioned that Firebase is so good at authentication that even if they didn't have all their other cool stuff that they have, he would still use Firebase just for authentication. It's that good. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to walk through what it's like to use authentication with Firebase. You're going to find it's really easy. You're going to find a lot of the examples I use seem like they're really easy because there's really not much to it. So it's hard to prepare a whole lecture around it when they've their job for the last few years is to make it really, really easy. But we're going to do it anyway. But first, one thing I don't like to do and one thing I hate that teachers do all the time is that they don't really check the experience level of all the participants, right? So who here feels confident with callbacks? It's a pretty fundamental JavaScript thing. Is there anyone who does it? If you don't feel comfortable, I can cover it in 2 minutes. So it's really quick. But if everyone's feeling comfortable with callbacks, we don't need to talk about it. I just hate when teachers make prior assumptions about the knowledge of the class without actually verifying that. So are we good with callbacks? Cool. We won't talk about them then. Also, to this app that I built and the app that we're going to go through, it's removed a lot of unnecessary complexities. I know, especially with building Angular apps, you can get pretty complex. You can have different modules and all these different things and use ifs, different patterns. We're just going to go with the most basic ones. So we have one module. It's going to be really simple because our focus today is about learning Firebase authentication and not really learning best practices in Angular and all those things. Okay. Also, too, I really like to do a lot of live coding examples in class. The problem with that is that opens me up to be pretty vulnerable because I'm going to make mistakes. When that happens, luckily we have the guys here who built this, so they can help me out. And if not, we can always look at the docs, and that'll help me out. If everyone wants to follow along, you can find this by going here. And there's this repo, which is UI router. And if you like React or React router, there's also this one that I built a while ago. But you can check out this one. You can check out this ng-conf blank branch, which is the specific one. And if you want to see all the code, it's here on mass ng-conf. Yeah. So any questions before we get started going into live coding stuff? Cool. Let's do it. This is the app we're going to build. So it's super simple. Again, because we're focusing mostly on Firebase authentication and kind of protecting routes in our front end, and we're not worried about a bunch of other stuff. So the biggest thing you'll notice, there's a dashboard, there's register and login. We can come here to register. You can put in your email and password, or you can register with any one of these fine services. And login looks very much the same. So really, really simple, again, because we're just focusing on authentication with Firebase. So the very first thing we're going to do is walk through this app. So where should we start? So we have a login and register folder. This folder contains some login, logout stuff. It contains some registration stuff. I apologize if you can't see that. I have never figured out a way to zoom in on this over here. So you just have to trust me with what's over there. We have some social buttons. But the biggest thing that we're going to deal with is this auth service in Angular. The reason for that is because we can pass the service around to different controllers, as we're going to do with our login and register controllers. So essentially, all of our Firebase-y kind of things are going to go inside this service. Again, there's multiple ways you can do this, and there's tens of ways people build Angular apps. But to make it simple, we're just going to put everything in this auth service that has to do with our Firebase authentication stuff, okay? We don't really need to walk through the code. It's kind of self-explanatory. If you look at the functioning app, where'd it go? So it's over here. So notice when we come here to register, the goal is to be able to do something like this. It will authenticate us with Facebook, and then notice our menu changed because now we're logged in. Really, really basic, but it's really, really great. So who here, again, sorry I asked this earlier, who here doesn't have experience with Firebase? They've never used Firebase before? Never? David East. He's never used it. This is amazing. You're going to learn so much. OK, so about half the room. OK.
Where's the repo for this?
That's a great question. It is at...
I'll tweet it with the hashtag ng-conf.
Yeah. GitHub/Tyler Mcginnis. And then it's this first one. Okay. And different branches you can check out with solutions and things like that. OK. So what we're going to do first is all these things. We're going to set up our Firebase service in order to be able to do a bunch of Firebase things later on. But for right now, it's just going to be some vanilla JavaScript stuff. The very first thing is we're going to create a reference to our Firebase. What we can do is you'll notice we're passing in Firebase here. We actually don't need that. But we're going to create this ref variable, and we're going to assign it to a new instance of Firebase. This FB URL thing, all it is it's a constant that can be found right here. So all it is it's essentially just a URL pointing back to my Firebase. When you sign up with Firebase, for those of you who haven't used it, when you create a new project, it gives you a new URL. So if I log in, that was weird. I have all these Firebase projects. The one I'm going to work on right here is auth all the things. Notice it gives me this URL. That URL is super important because for those of you who've done like REST commands, a lot of it is based off the URL. It's kind of the same thing with Firebase, where when we create a new reference to our Firebase, we're going to say, hey, Firebase, I want to create a new instance of you. We're passing that URL. And they're going to just give us back an object with a bunch of cool properties on it that we can use in order to query our database, in order to put something into our database, in order to authenticate things. So this is kind of where all the magic is happening, is inside of this Firebase function invocation. Okay? So this ref variable, like I mentioned earlier, is just an object with a bunch of Firebase properties on it, and really, really handy ones. So now we have a reference to our Firebase. Now we're going to create a user property on our service using Get Off. So Firebase comes with this very handy Get Auth property. And what it does is it just synchronously retrieves the current authentication state of the client. So meaning it's going and saying, hey, if someone is authenticated, it'll give us back certain details about that user. And if they're not authenticated, it'll just give us back null, I believe. Right, guys? Cool. So what we're going to do is I'm going to add user to our service. And I'm going to say ref.getOff. What we're going to do now, inside of our directive and everywhere else in our code, we're just going to check for this user, because that's kind of the variable that we're going to look at and toggle the menu with based on if this user is a thing. Okay? And I apologize for sliding back and forth. It's kind of the only way I could figure out how to do this without memorizing all the steps for this, which is kind of lame in a live demo because it takes away all the fun. So I'll just be sliding back and forth. So what we're going to do now is make a save new user function. So kind of what's going to happen is that when we first register with Firebase, Firebase is going to do a few things for us, and it's going to not do a few things. The things that it's going to do for us is it's inside of their system. They're going to create a new user for us. So if we come in down here to login and auth, if you scroll down a little bit, all of these are the users that Firebase has created and they've saved for us. But what they don't do, and it's kind of weird at first, but you get used to it, and I can see why they don't, is they don't save that user for you in your database anywhere. So what I like to do, and what they recommend, is that whenever you register someone, get that user's information and come save them as part of your database. So now whenever we wanted to find out more information about anyone, we can come and query this user / this endpoint, and we can get some of their information. Okay? The way we're going to do that is when we invoke save new user, we're going to pass them a user object. And then we grab our ref, and we can do .child. So when we do .child, all it's saying is go to this user collection and put whatever information I have and put it in this collection. So we can, if we had nested children, we can do /user /whatever until we get our actual data. So we're going to go take our data, go to /users, then go to user_obj.id. Every time we register someone new with Firebase, it gives us, the thing that it gives us back has an ID to it, which is unique, and they look very much like this. So it's with who they authenticated with, and then this random hash, which is probably just some timestamp or something. So we go there, and then we're going to use .set to put the information inside the database. So now whenever we invoke save new user and we pass it a user object, that information will be saved inside of user, and the key will be whatever that user's authentication was and some random hash, and then all their information will be inside of there. Okay? Any questions so far? Cool. The very next thing we're going to do is logged in prop on our service. So it's convenient to know if the user is logged in or not. So what we can do is create a function. And there's probably better ways to do this. But essentially, this double bang will just turn it into a Boolean. So we get our user. And if it's truthy, meaning if it's an actual user, if it's an object, we're going to turn it into true. If it's not, we're going to return false. Okay? Any questions there? So we haven't really done much Firebase-y stuff, but we're kind of setting up to eventually do that. Question right here.
Just this.user, is that ever going to update if someone's like logging in?
Yep, exactly. When someone logs in later, we can capture that, and then we can re-update this user.
Okay, so it just hasn't happened yet.
It hasn't happened yet. Yep, it will. This was part of like almost like the config kind of stuff, setting up for when we do eventually log someone in. Now we can just update this variable, and everything that's watching that variable will be good to go. Cool. All right, so far so good with live coding. Step number 2, this is where we're going to start doing some Firebase-y stuff. So we're going to create a login with password method. And what we're going to do is whenever we call this, we're going to go through all these steps. And I'm sorry this looks super gross. But like I said, I didn't want to memorize all these steps because that's not fun. So I just kind of gave myself a hint here. So Firebase has this thing called auth with password. It's really convenient. And if we go to the docs, it'll tell us a little bit about it. Probably the biggest thing I want you to take away from this lecture is even if you don't have a lot of experience with Firebase, they've put a lot of time into their documentation. It's really, really good. In fact, you could probably all learn this thing just by looking at their docs in the same amount of time it would take me to teach you. It's that good. So I feel kind of silly up here just talking about this simple authentication thing when the documentation is really good as well. So if we go down here, we'll notice auth with password. What we do is we pass it an object, which just contains our user information, the email and password. And then we pass it a callback function to invoke when Firebase is done authenticating that user or logging that user in. Notice when Firebase will invoke this, they'll pass it two things, an error and some authentication data. If there's an error, they log that. In this example, if it's good, they log that as well. Okay? So what we're going to do is this is going to take in 3 things as parameters. And we'll talk about this one in a little bit. But just as we found in our documentation, we're going to pass in a user object. And we're going to pass in a callback to invoke when Firebase is done getting us or doing everything that they're doing in the back end. Okay? So now what we're going to do is use ref.auth with password. We need to pass it 2 things. Those things are this user object we're getting from right here and this callback. Cool. That feels better. OK, so we passed it our user object. Then we pass this callback to invoke when our users when the user has been given to us by Firebase. Then what we do is we have an if-else statement. Sorry. So we're going to check to see if there's an error. For now, we'll just console.log error. If there's not, then what we're going to do is we're going to invoke the callback that we passed it when we originally invoked login with password. And we're going to pass it auth data. Now, the question you should have right now is, what exactly is this callback? Let's go ahead and check that out. We need to find when this function was invoked in order to get that information. So let's search for it. We logged it here. So it looks like in our controller, we log in, we get some information from our scope. We reset that information, and then we call it. We pass it the user object, and we pass it just a function. And all that function's doing is it's saying, go to this dashboard when the user logs in. So we want to invoke this function, which is the callback function. Once Firebase says, hey, everything's good, there wasn't any errors, so we invoke this function, which will take us to the dashboard. Okay? Everything looks good. Any questions so far? I have 30 minutes, right?
Correct.
Cool. Notice we forgot to do that. Remember how we talked about when Firebase creates us a user, when we register with Firebase, it doesn't save that information into the database. So we need to do that ourselves. Add email to auth data. Set user property. So we're going to go here. When we log in, we are going to set the user variable we had earlier, that property, essentially reset it to this new auth data. You might know this, you might not. Whenever you have these nested functions, that this keyword gets all messed up. That's an entirely different talk. So we're just going to use .bind so that our this keyword is the right this. And if you want to know more about that, come talk to me after, because I should be able to explain that in like 5 or 10 minutes. OK, so login with password. Let me make sure we got everything. Auth with password, if else. Add email to auth data. Set user property. I have this in my notes, so I'm going to do it. We're essentially just adding on the email to this auth data thing that Firebase gave us, and then setting the user there. When Firebase gives us that data back, that user's data back, there's no email on it, apparently, because that's what I did. So I added it there. Set the user property. So now what we're going to do, notice we passed in this callback on register. This is kind of weird, and there's probably better ways to do this. But essentially, I'm eventually going to call login with password whenever I register. Because what we want to have happen is when someone registers, we do all the Firebase stuff, we save that information, and then we don't want them to have to log in. We want to do that automatically. So we'll have them register, and then immediately inside of our function, we'll do our login stuff, and that'll make sure that they see the page that they want to see rather than having to log in after they register. So all this is saying is, hey, if this is a thing that was passed in, which it will be only when we register, then go ahead and invoke that function. When we finish all of our code, I can walk through this and it'll make a little bit more sense. But for now, you'll have to trust me. That works fairly well. Okay? Any questions on step 2? So all we've done is create a login with password method. So whenever they log in, or even whenever they register, we're going to invoke this, which will change that user variable that we set up here, which our directive will then see, and our directive will update the menu. Step 3, some more stuff. So now we need to create a create user method. Essentially, now, whenever anyone goes to register, the functionality that we're going to create right now is what's going to be invoked. Very first thing, create user method. We're going to pass it a user and a callback. So we're invoking these things from our controllers. So this user, all it is some scope properties that someone put in an input field. When we invoked, or when we clicked the button, it took that information. Technically, it didn't. When we click a button, it goes to our controller and runs a function. That function grabs some things from the scope, which was bound to the input boxes. It sends that information to the service, and then we have it here. And it also sends a callback, which we can look at in a bit. So create user. We are going to use Firebase's handy create user. And if we read about it, or if we even just look at the examples, it looks like in order to create a user, we pass it this user object, the same thing as logging in. And then we pass it a callback to invoke when they're done creating that user for us inside Firebase. So we want to pass it our user object. And all that is it's an object with an email and a password property. And then we pass it a function to invoke. They're going to invoke it with an error and user data again. So I'm going to copy this beautiful code. So if there was an error, then go ahead and tell us which error it was. If there wasn't an error, then we want to do a few things. What we want to do is invoke login with password, right? Because at this process right here, they've entered in their information, they've hit register, it's done some Firebase stuff, and Firebase said, hey, they're good, all their information's correct or whatever. So now what we want to do, as we talked about earlier, is take that user and log them in, okay? So we are going to invoke the function we ran earlier, login with password. And we're going to use the .bind magic again. Notice this function takes in 3 things: a user object, a callback, and a callback on a register. So we're going to pass it the user. Check my notes. User, new function, and callback. Okay. Okay, the user is going to just be the object with the email and password. This function is going to do some stuff. And then callback was the thing that we passed in when we invoked create user. And if we check out that real fast, all it was the thing that's changing our state, essentially. It's changing the view. All right. So we invoke it, pass it those 3 things. This new function, if we follow this rabbit hole, when we call login with password, that throws us up here. We do auth with password, which logs us into Firebase. Then we invoke the function we passed in, passing it that authenticated data. So here we have access to auth data. And what we're going to do is now call our save new user function, which we created earlier. What's up, Kent? Have you been teaching conferences all day? Because you look kind of worn out.
I'm really tired.
OK, so what's happened when we register? Let's walk through this. We register. It invokes this property on our service. We use a Firebase create user method. We pass it the user. We pass it this function. It's going to go and do some Firebase-y things. It's going to give us back that user data. We're then going to where did I go wrong? Create user. We're just going to keep going. We call login with password. We pass it the user. It'll eventually give us auth data when it invokes our callback. And then we save that new auth data we got. Okay? So I have 1 minute left. What I want to show you real quick is what I think is the best part of Firebase. And we won't go through it, but I'll kind of show you a little bit about it. It's this login with auth pop-up. So up to this point, all we've done is gotcha. Perfect. So all we've done is we've worried about people authenticating just with their email and password. Firebase is super handy, and they say, hey, that's nice, but there's also all these other options that we can authenticate with, like Facebook and Twitter and GitHub and Gmail. That would be really nice to provide as a convenience for our service. So if you look at this, all you do is you call ref, just like we had earlier, auth with OAuth pop-up. You pass it the thing you want to authenticate with. So this right here is either going to be GitHub, Twitter, Gmail, or Facebook. Thank you. It goes, it opens up a new thing. It asks you, hey, do you want to authenticate? And then when you click yes, I do, give them my Facebook information, Firebase will run this function. And what it looks like is wrong branch. This right here. So notice we called it. We passed the service. So when we invoke login with auth pop-up, we give it one of those things. Essentially, when I click on GitHub, it's going to invoke this function, passing it the string GitHub. We add that user to our Firebase, just like we would when someone enters their email and password. We set that user, and then we invoke the callback, which is just changing our state. So a lot of the patterns essentially the exact same pattern we did earlier follows the same whenever we're doing authentication with Facebook and GitHub or anything like that. I'm sorry I didn't get to that because that's really the best part of this whole presentation. But I think that's it. The logout method is as easy as that. Really, really nice. You get your reference, you call unauth, and Firebase will log out for you. And then you can change your route or whatever. That's it. The biggest takeaway from this, like I mentioned earlier, the docs are really, really good. And if you haven't used Firebase, definitely check it out. All of the talks that you'll see on Firebase is all about like three-way data binding and all these cool things that they're doing. Rarely does anyone talk about authentication, sadly, because the rest of their product is really, really good as well. But authentication is one of those things where it's really, really handy, and it's really, really nice, especially if you're a beginner, because you don't have to worry about passport or any of those things. And it works essentially out of the box. That's it. Any questions? Cool. If you have any questions on like bind or this or any like those JavaScript fundamental stuff, I can talk about that all day long. So come find me. Thanks, everyone.